And we're moving on in this session to the world of clinical professionals, therapists, and the kind of information that's been published in books for them, and the current climate of gender affirmative beliefs that has taken over our gender identity services. And I'll just say, I have read about this subject on the other side, as I always do. And the information that's going out is very different to the published books by the authors I've got with me in this session. And I'm really thrilled to introduce Dr. Hakeem, who's a consultant psychiatrist who completed training at the Tavistock Centre. He's founder of the Sure Mind Foundation, which is a mental health charity, an honorary associate clinical professor at the University College London. And in spring 2018, he published a book called Trans, Exploring Gender Identity and Gender Dysphoria. I'm also thrilled to welcome Sue and Marcus Evans. Sue Evans is a psychoanalytic psychotherapist, working for nearly 40 years in the NHS, including the National Gender Identity Service at the Tavistock. She directs an international family consultation service for children and young adults experiencing gender identity issues. She's a member of the British Psychotherapy Foundation, the London Psychoanalytic, all these words I have to say, Psychotherapy Service, and is registered with the British Psychoanalytic Council. She's co-author with Marcus of the book Gender Dysphoria, a Therapeutic Model for Children, Adolescents and Young People. Marcus Evans is a psychoanalyst with the British Psychoanalytic Society. He worked as an adult psychotherapist in the NHS for over 40 years. He's clinical lead of the adult, or was clinical lead of the adult and adolescent departments at the Tavistock Portman Trust for 5 years, and resigned as a governor in 2019. Marcus is the author of 2 books on applying psychoanalytic thinking in mental health settings, Making Room for Madness in Mental Health, and Psychoanalytic Thinking in Mental Health Settings, and is co-author with Sue of Gender Dysphoria, a Therapeutic Model for Working with Children, Adolescents and Young Adults. So huge welcome to you all, and thank you for coming. I think this is a really important part of today's discussion, what's happening in the clinical world, and you know that's an area that I'm very, very concerned with. And I want to start with you, because your book was published in 2018, and I came across this by accident. The publisher, Trigger Publishing, contacted me. Don't worry, I have a copy. Contacted me with an interest in publishing my book, Communicating with Kids. And I went to have a look at their website and their titles. And I thought, this is quite a good list of titles. They look interesting books. And then I came across Trans, Dr. Hakeem, who's he? And I bought the book. So this is back in 2018, 2019. And I thought, so how did this go under the radar? Because Stonewall weren't going on about you. It was completely new to me. I had no idea who you were, but I found the book so interesting. So can you tell me and us why you felt it was necessary? What brought you to writing that book?
So I've got the sort of the unique position of being the only consultant psychiatrist in medical psychotherapy who specialises in gender dysphoria for adults, and I have been the only one since I've been doing this for 22 years. So I was doing it before it was ever cool or fashionable. And I started doing this at the Tavistock and Portman, where all of my colleagues were going, what on earth are you doing this strange stuff for? Whereas it wasn't that strange, because my colleagues were treating paedophiles and rapists and all sorts of perverts. So it wasn't that strange, really. But they were thinking, why on earth are you interested in this? And I was interested because no one seemed to be able to think about it. And if you look at the service that I provided, I've been doing this for 22 years. Thankfully, it's not all I do. It's a small proportion of what I do. And most of what I do is other stuff. But I've been doing this consistently for 22 years. And for up to 2017, from 2000 to 2017, I've been writing loads. I've been publishing loads in therapeutic and psychiatric literature. And what I realised now is the only people that read academic literature, the people who write it themselves. No one else reads it. So when I was working at the Tavistock for 12 years running the service, none of my colleagues really cared about the service. They weren't really interested in me talking about it. They thought I was some strange oddbod doing this strange service. So, and I was thinking, isn't it a shame that I'm doing this service? It needs to be quite helpful, and patients seem to benefit from it, and nobody seems to know that I'm doing this. And I was sort of working in isolation, unbeknownst to the most of the world, apart from some trans activists that had, managed to read one of my articles. And then in 2017, I got the opportunity to write this book, which I've been meaning to write for ages. And then all of a sudden, people sort of realised what I was doing. And then I discovered Twitter. I'm always the last to discover anything. So I discovered Twitter millions of years after everyone else discovered Twitter. So I discovered Twitter and all the gender critical world. And I actually thought I was the only gender critical person in the world for ages. And now I realise that there's actually quite a lot of us. So writing the book allowed me to have an audience of people to be aware of the work I was doing that I haven't been having for 2 decades while I've been doing it. So it was great for me to be able to write the book.
So you felt, you talk about a lack of curiosity in this area, and
totally.
and you brought out something that I found really interesting, because it was creative. What you were doing with the mixed therapy groups was creative, and anything else I'd seen up to that point was very fixed and very certain. So Sue and Marcus, if you want to answer this question together, what made you think it was important to publish gender dysphoria? What brought you to that?
So, well, our story sort of started individually, but came together. So I'll start. So I went to work at the Tavistock in 2003, and shortly after I started working in the adult department, a post came up in the Gender Identity Development Service, as it was known then. And I took the post, and I went there thinking that the work was going to be very similar to the rest of the Tavistock at that time, which was you meet with patients, you listen to their story, you try to understand with them what's going on, and you try to help them think about themselves, and you sort of take a holistic view, a sort of neutral view, and you work together in that way. When I went to the clinic, so I was new in the clinical team meeting, and actually Az and I met there after he came to work there for a short period of time. So I was really glad when he came, because he was actually
both troublemakers.
We were quietly in the corner there, but actually no, we weren't. So anyway, but I remember sitting in a clinical team meeting, and there was a presentation of a 16-year-old lad, complex background, challenging behaviours going on and so on, and another clinician said they would assess them. And then it was only a few months later that they came back and said, I'm recommending them to go to the clinic for puberty blockers. And I said, can I ask how many times you've met with that child? And they said 4. And it was like a heart-stop moment for me. And then, of course, I started to watch more closely what was going on. And at the time, Dr. Domenico Gicellier was in charge, and Dr. Carmichael was the number 2. They were meeting with mermaids. I felt gradually aware that there was an influence coming into the clinical setting from outside, and it was the first time I come across it. I then started to try and question things, and when I took it up with the team meeting once, as you say, we weren't that quiet, as you're right, and I said, but why aren't we working for longer periods of time? Why aren't we only offering children psychotherapy at this stage? And I was told, because if we don't offer the hormone treatments, the kids won't come. And again, it's a sort of heart-stopping moment where you think, so we are a gateway service rather than a therapeutic service. So to cut a long story short, I did really, really try to flag it up. Az and I both were vocal in the team meetings and expressed our concerns. It didn't go anywhere within the team. So then I went and spoke to the clinical senior management and effectively whistleblew, and Dr. David Taylor did a report.
That was back in 2005, wasn't it?
2005.
First whistleblower.
Yes. Yeah. And anyone in the UK who might have seen the Newsnight report on that was done by Hannah Barnes, his report, and it was interesting. She interviewed me about it. It was the first time I'd laid eyes on it. So I was working in the unit. I never saw the outcome of the report. He more or less flagged up all the concerns about the service that have more recently been flagged up yet again. And so Az and I think at the time were very aware of what was going on. Cut forward, I in the end felt, after I'd attended a conference where the lead speaker said, this shouldn't even be happening in a mental health trust, and there was cheering in the audience, I thought, okay, we're not trying to think about the children and their minds and their whole worlds now. It's become very political. But I, in the end, left because I found it too difficult. Az had left a while before on a rotation, and I felt too lonely and isolated. So I left. Wind forward a few years.
So
basically, when I retired from the NHS, I took up a position as governor. As people know, Dave Bell was approached by people working within the service who had very similar concerns to the ones Az and Sue were aware of. We're now in 2018 and wrote this report. The Trust knew about it, but when the findings came out, it was explosive. And basically at the same time, there were 10 parents who had also written a letter to the Trust Board basically saying, we expected our kids to be psychologically evaluated. That hasn't happened, and they're being fast-tracked through. And a few of us were sort of arguing with the Trust that this is a contentious area. The usual approach would be to look thoroughly at what's going on, but none of that happened. It became very apparent the Trust wanted to bury the problem and shoot the messenger, Dave Bell. After working out that there was no interest within the Trust of looking at this seriously, I resigned. And then all hell broke loose. There were all sorts of people contacting me from the papers who knew all about this. Like a lot of the journalists were way ahead where, I mean, I knew about it because of Sue from years back. But then we got invited by Posey Parker to the House of Lords at the event that you spoke at. That was a very important
Standing for Women, wasn't it?
Standing for Women. And again, my eyes were opened by how knowledgeable endocrinologists from the States, there was yourself, there were parent groups, and then more sort of media follow-up. And then there was a sort of feeling that, you know, usually you rely on medical authority to come to some sort of consensus and look after its own house. But what do you do when the medical authorities are captured? Where do you go? So I had another one of those moments, because in the meeting where I met you, Stephanie, they had a representative there from the Tavistock who sort of stood up, and she read a statement which said, we do very thoughtful and lengthy assessments. And I just thought, no, I cannot let this pass. And so I stood up and I said, I know that is not true. I've worked there. And really, because I did that, I was then contacted by parents, and out of that network of people, the judicial review started with Mother A, Mrs. A, who was the mother of a child, and she feared for her daughter going to the service. She'd been referred to the service. We started the judicial review off, and I collected, you know, all the expert witnesses along with the solicitor and Mrs. A. And then Kira Bell became one of the witnesses. And in the end, she seemed like the best person to take it forward. She's a detransition. I'm sure everyone knows her name by now, so I won't go into that. But she took it forward. And initially, the judges found that children they deemed were not able under the age of 16, and they clarified them in categories, but they said they felt they were unable to consent to this, what is still an experimental treatment, really. So it kind of then took us forward, because while that was going on, I said to Marcus, well, just in case they're successful, we need to put something in place to offer to the clinicians, because they're going to turn around and say, okay, if we can't give them hormone blockers and hormones, what can we do? So that was why we decided to start writing the book. And of course,
got a background because we were being contacted by, and Marcus has worked for a long time with adult transsexuals, and we had quite a lot of experience of being able to say, okay, let's talk about our experience of working with adolescents and young adults in this world. So that was really the main.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't have a lot, I had a bit, but what I did know, a bit more of the history, was I used to run a para-suicide service in Kings in the late 80s, early 90s, and it's so typical of this weird area that where sort of the usual rules don't apply, where there's this sort of false science put out, and the false science, as we know about this, is only 1%, this is going back in time, when there are very small numbers, only 1% of people who transition regret it. Well, we used to get sort of steady flow of people in the 1980s. They'd have complex problems, they believed that transition would sort their problems out, they realised that it didn't sort their problems out, and they become suicidal, and we see them in casualty. Now that was in the 80s.
And Az and I worked together on cases, and we saw people individually. And the thing is, what you know about this area is that there's a way in which mental health and psychological issues, they want to sort of disaggregate them. And I think you have to look and work holistically with curiosity about the whole child, the whole person, and
there was none of that curiosity in GID. There was total collusion from all angles. So I remember you'd get this sort of 4-year-old coming in, and there's a fait accompli. The parents is what I call the transsexogenic parent. The parent says, "Oh, Johnny wants to be called Mary now. We've got him a wig. We've told all his friends. We've told the school. We're changing his name." And he knows that he's trapped in the wrong body. We're going to give him puberty blockers, and it was all a fait accompli because she'd watched some Channel 4 documentary for 30 minutes and she was an expert. And there's no way back for this. And when you get the child then goes to these specialist clinicians who say, "Oh yes, you've got this disorder, this problem, we can help you," there was none of that. "Oh, why do you think you should be married?" Why? There was no curiosity, and there was no thought that this could be a sort of a mad response. And I remember saying, and I won't say who said it, but there was someone very significant in the department who I said to them, "Isn't there something mad about what we're doing here?" And he said, "Well, is it any more mad than if the child was to be gay?" And that was, for me, that was that summed up completely the context for which GIDS had arisen. There was this sort of institutional homophobia of long standing that was that was as mad as everything else. And it was that rather than exploring this child who could be a bit sort of gender non-conforming and perhaps a bit camp and a bit of this or the other, that was not an issue. It was very binary. And my work with the trans people showed that it was very complex, and there was lots of different things. And the idea that they're all now called trans is ridiculous, because you've got completely different subgroups who are very distinctly different and have different operating characteristics that are all lumped together, which is why you get sort of fetishistic transvestites and autogynephiles who are treated the same way as people who are on the autistic spectrum, who would otherwise be called the transsexuals. And this denial that anybody's getting excited in changing rooms, even though on Twitter we see lots of evidence of people proudly posting photos of how excited they are in women's changing rooms. And so what I wanted from my book was to convey the complexity of what I found over the last 20 years into something which was so easy to understand that a 12-year-old can pick it off the shelf and read it. And I had contributors, and I said to all the contributors, please write this with a reading age of 12. I'm not writing for colleagues. I've been writing for colleagues for decades. They never read it. I want to write for the general public and for confused teenagers, for confused parents, confused adults. I don't want them to have to require to understand anything. So there's no jargon. Any jargon is explained. And so you think you're reading a simple book, but by the end of it, you should know the 11 different types of transvestite, the different types of transsexual, and the difference between an autogynephile, autoandrophile. And so I hope it works in that respect. But that was the aim.
It's something that I noticed about both your books. They're so accessible to the lay reader like me, about psychoanalysis, etc. But and also they're so valuable because they're coming from you as professionals who've worked with transsexuals, with adult transsexuals, with children and adolescents. So you know what you're doing, you know, you have that expertise behind you. And reading a book from these books by Professor Christina Richards and Ben Vincent, it's like the difference between reading a Stonewall political manifesto compared to the Cass interim report, which is what your books. But everything, all of your concerns have been vindicated, haven't they, by the Newsnight reports and the newspaper reports and you know, recently the Cass interim report, that everything you've been concerned about is being you're sort of exonerated. I think it's incredibly important. I mean, I recommend these books to parents because I think they are so insightful about what the complexity of this area and the differences for different people. You know, we're not all one size fits all, trans or non-binary. So what has the reaction been to your books? I think, as you did get, you got a bit of pushback, didn't you, for your book?
Well, actually, for the book, I didn't. The trans terrorists, as I call them, and I use the word carefully because the idea of a terrorist is they try and instill terror. And I think the authors that we've heard so far talked about, and you know, Heather put it beautifully, there was a moment where she thought her life was going to be ruined. So I don't use the word trans terrorist lightly. The point of the trans terrorist is to instill fear into the person that their life will be ruined. So it's a very specific term, trans terrorist. And I think activist is too benign a term. An activist stands on the street with a placard. The trans terrorist tries to destroy the life of the person who they're attacking. And I think I expected a massive backlash from trans terrorists from my book, but actually there wasn't. You know, I took out special insurance, especially, but it was fine. The book, because actually, if you read the book, it's reasonable. I'm not being angry and opinionated. I did in the past write things that maybe have been upsetting to people, but this wasn't really. But the very notion of a psychiatrist who's offering a service to trans people which doesn't involve hormones and surgery was offensive to a certain group of people, and that was enough to mobilise me. So it wasn't the book; it was the awareness that I existed, and then I've been on a hit list. Of you know, the trans terrorist hit list of lives should be destroyed ever since. They know who I am. And it's not because of the book, but because they know that I exist. So it's a bit like the sort of the top 10 chart is the sort of who they're going to be gunning down next.
And recently they tried to nail you for conversion therapy.
Oh, I mean, that totally backfired. So,
yes.
So they, I mean, obviously I can't talk about the case, but I can talk about the article. And there was, on Twitter, there was a sort of a thing out for ages saying, have you ever been a patient of me? I'm a journalist who wants your... So then someone obviously came forward, and in the article, the 17-year-old stated that he questioned my gender identity. Well, that's the whole point of the assessment, isn't it? The whole point of the assessment is, and it was quite clear that they didn't want to be there. So in the article, they talk about ending the session early, questioning their gender identity, and the backlash from that on Twitter was the majority of responses were, well, thank God somebody's doing their job and somebody's actually asking questions, and he's a psychiatrist, what do you expect? So in a way, it was counterproductive because it showed, well, if somebody is trying to, you know, most parents who have a child who's questioning their gender hope that that their child will see a clinician who will ask the question, why do you think you're this gender?
Yeah.
They hope that. But what this article showed is that any clinician who dares ask that is then vilified, on a hit list, their careers ruined, and that showed, well, that's the risk of the therapy conversion bill, including trans, is because nobody will ask your child why they're confused about gender, because it's not worth their, I have now decided, actually, I'd much rather concentrate on detransitioners, because they're less likely to make my life hell. You know, none of my OCD, ADHD, depression, anxiety, trauma patients try and destroy my life. why, you know, my PA was saying, why on earth are you still treating these people? And I said, well, I'll just concentrate on the detransitioners. There's not much of a service for them. So, you know, so that's been the fallout, is that I've decided I'd rather, for, you know, hassle-free life, I'd rather my gender work, I'd rather write about it, do this, teach about it, maybe do less clinical work in that respect, and focus my clinical work on non-trans or detrans. So that's been a backlash, and that'll be the fallout for gender dysphoria, is that the only services they'll get will be hormones and surgery.
And there's a real need for proper pathways and care for detransitioners. That's a group that's completely ignored. And what about you, Sue and Marcus? What's the reaction been to your book? Have you got any hassle from writing it, or has it been positive?
I mean, it's interesting. You don't tend to look on the sort of the people that attack us on Twitter. I've seen some amazing slurs from Twitter. I had one which was just beautifully written. It was the most vile attack on my personality. It involved my bald head and their backside. It was fantastic. I've lost it. I don't know what I've done with it anyway. But by and large, the thing is that one of the most disappointing things is the contact with the journals, and so that in a way you feel that the journals are very anxious. So there's the British Psychiatric Bulletin published a paper of mine, and they got absolutely attacked left, right, and rhubarb, and then I had to give a massive defence. Now, in fairness to them, they then published my paper, then the other side. I was invited to sort of write a letter in response, but I didn't do that. But, you know, I had a complaint against me, completely fictitious complaint, but I had to get a lawyer to defend me for a sort of bogus complaint. It was just designed to create anxiety, as Az was talking. The other, just there are many examples, but the other thing was that the Lancet spoke to me, did an interview, and they were going to run the interview, and then the guy came back. He said, "I've never known this in my, you know, time of working here. They've got the lawyers in because they're so anxious," and in the end, the article was dropped. So that you feel that there isn't a level playing field, because normally we would expect the scientific journals to, you know, they do one side of the argument and the other side of the argument, and you'd argue it out clinically. But as in so many areas, we're not operating in the usual environment. The politicisation, as Sue has said, it prevents the usual sort of dialogue and thought from going on. Not everywhere, but in a lot of places.
Yeah, anything in opposition or challenging it becomes bigotry.
Yeah.
What about you? You're both quite low profile on Twitter.
Quite low profile. I don't really understand how it works. Honestly, I
probably best.
We stick to clinical.
We try to stay with the clinical work, and I think more and more. I just think that that's sort of where our value is, and I think, as is right, this terror. You know, that you do. I have these moments where I think, I hope not. I can't deny, I've worked 40 years in the NHS in so many different areas. I've never been accused by a patient of bigotry or racism or homophobia or transphobia. But it is horrible when people do that publicly, or they accuse our book. Like on Amazon, there's one that's described, the review said, this is just conversion therapy. But I thought, I'd like to do a bit of good news. So our reviews actually on Amazon, what there are not bad. But this one literally gave me a lump in my throat. So I won't read it all, but it was someone named Ash, and his title or her title said, "Help me with my gender dysphoria." They talked about, I socially and medically transitioned and realised it wasn't working for me. I then came across Marcus Evans in an interview, and they looked up the book. I'm so glad I did. Best purchase I've ever made. My gender dysphoria has disappeared. It's a true miracle. Thank you so much to Marcus and Susan. So I think in the dark moments, when I do get worried and I think it would be easier just to give this all up, I also do really think about the families and the patients, and think it's really important that we don't back down and just try to keep going with the clinical work. And, you know, we're learning all the time. I think it's changing all the time. Our book already has elements to it that you think, yeah, that's changed already. But for me, it's that mixture of, it's horrible. I won't deny it hasn't affected me, but I also think it's really important that we do it.
You raised a really important point, that you get all these attacks, but on the other side, you know that your work has value and people are really, really grateful for it. And your book covers so much, you know, it goes into detransitioners, autism, comorbidities, and
Can't hear you, Stephanie.
Sorry, the CAS interim report exonerates, you know, the conclusion of that is that these children deserve the same level, the same standards of care as every other child in any other paediatric service, and that's what you're doing. That you're doing exactly what CAS has recommended. So I'm just going to end. Sorry, Marcus. I was just going to end, Marcus, but
yeah, I was just going to say to Az, because we contact Az from time to time, but I was going to say I was depressed at what was going on psychologically. I thought this was appalling. I've been proud to work in mental health. Yeah. This is appalling psychiatry. It's awful. Yeah. And so partly the passion of writing the book is as a proud mental health practitioner and proud of the Tavistock's traditions, which has been ruined by this episode. Appalling. To put proper psychological thought, you know, put our contribution in. Anyway, that's all I was going to say.
And do you regret it? That's my final question. No.
That's all.
No.
I don't regret it. I've got another 2 books in the pipeline, but work is so busy I haven't actually managed to even reach out to any publishers yet. But I've got 2 books. One of them will be a follow-up to Trans, calling Detrans, because in the 22 years of my work in this field, 26% of my patients are detransitioners. Yeah. And they're the people that aren't meant to exist. You know? So, and this 1% is nonsense because no one is ever followed up. So where did they get this 1% from? Yeah. And all of my detransitioners were never asked whether they regretted it or not. So they're absent data. So it's a huge amount. So there's a wealth of knowledge out there that needs to be put into a book. And so I'd love to do a follow-up, Detrans, and then there's another one, which is an overview of gender critical thinking. So if anybody wants to be my agent, that'd be great.
The other thing I would just say, you've reminded me, Az, and I must say this because we had such brilliant support from Phoenix Publishing. So that unlike some of the other stories we've heard, we had no pushback. We just had total support. So we were really grateful for that. It's been brilliant.
Cool, because my current publisher said, when I asked them, they said, "Oh, this doesn't sound like a happy ever after story. Can you have some stories of happy transition?" I said, "No, that's not exactly that. That's not the point of Detrans. No."
So what I want to say is a huge thank you on behalf of parents who I know are so grateful to you for continuing with your ethics, your principles, what you know is right for these children, because parents can't find anybody but an affirming therapist. So this is the book from Dr. Az, Trans, and this is the book from Sue and Marcus, Gender Dysphoria. I'd really recommend these books for anybody, you know, they're very, very accessible and so rich, so much in them. You could read them again and again. And again, as alternatives, if anybody comes and says, "Well, I've read this and I know what to do." Well, here's an alternative, and here's an alternative. Read these and then let me know what you think. So thank you so much for your work. It's really crucially important work, and putting those books out into the world where they can be passed on and given as gifts and passed around. And thank you so much for coming on and chatting today. I could have chatted.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for
a lot longer.
For inviting us.
Our last session is going to be with Kathleen Stock and Helen Joyce. Thank you.